Booktube, it's Breckie from Breckie Writes. This is Breckie Reads, and it's time for my June wrap-up. So June was a slow reading month for me. I just could not get in the mood to sit down and read. That being said, there are still 9 books to wrap up, so let's get started. Okay, the first thing to say is that June is the first month all year I've had a DNF. That's right, my first DNF of the year is Falling Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes. Now, this is a really popular series. People on Booktube absolutely love it. That's why I picked it up. I actually bought the first 3 books in this series. And you guys, I got through 6 chapters of this and thought it was so silly, so predictable, so ridiculous, and so poorly written on a sentence level that I could not force myself to read anymore. I decided to take a pause, look at some reviews, and basically everyone says that this series doesn't even get good until the end of book 2, going into the beginning of book 3. And frankly, life is too short to read 3 books in a series in which I don't give a crap about the characters, and this was such a disappointment. And I gave this 1 star because that's what I give to books I DNF. 1 star. I was not impressed, and I don't think I'll be picking this up. Like, nope. Okay, for the 9 books I actually finished this month, I'm gonna split them into the audiobooks that I read and then the physical books that I read. So the first audiobook I read is the only one I actually own a physical copy of, and that is The Great Gatsby. Now, The Great Gatsby also fulfilled my TBR jar challenge to reread a book that I was assigned in high school, and I had to read The Great Gatsby, I think my freshman or sophomore year of high school, and then I read it again in college. This was actually my dad's copy of The Great Gatsby from way back in the day. You can see his notes. Now, I listened to the Jake Gyllenhaal rereading of this, and you guys, I loved it. I identified so much more with Gatsby and Daisy. Being an adult, being the same age as the characters actually, has allowed me to appreciate the tragedy so much more for what it is. The writing is superb. F. Scott Fitzgerald just knows how to string a sentence together. I highly, highly recommend, if you have not read this since you were in high school, or if you've never read it, please pick this up. This is worth rereading. It's only like 150 pages, so you can get through it pretty quickly. The story is tragic and beautiful. It's a story about hope gone awry. It's the story about the stories we tell ourselves in order to get through our lives. It's a story about tragic heroes and also what money does to us and how it can numb us. It's about broken things, and it's a beautiful story. I actually changed my Goodreads review from 4 stars to 5 stars upon rereading it. That's how much I enjoyed it. So yeah, Great Gatsby, 5 stars. The next audiobook I read was Rising Strong by Brene Brown. Now, Brene Brown is a social worker and a sociologist who has done a lot of research around shame. Shame and vulnerability, and how shame keeps us from being vulnerable, and how shame triggers are what keep us from risking and doing things that are difficult. And I suffer from anxiety, and a lot of that is around shame triggers, so I really, really appreciate Brene Brown's work. Now, Rising Strong is different than Daring Greatly and The Power of Vulnerability and some of her other works, because instead of being a lot of theory around shame and kind of what causes us shame, this is more of a, okay, so you have experienced shame, you're walking into vulnerability, how do you actually negotiate and move through that process? So she splits it up into 3 sections and kind of gives you some tools. It's not a step-by-step self-help book, but it certainly gives you a lot of anecdotal stories and a lot of Brene Brown's characteristic Texan, in your face, real to life, telling you how it is, sort of nuance. She reads the audiobook herself, so I recommend it as much for that reason as for the actual content, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next audiobook that I listened to this month was Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Between the World and Me is an essay, but it's written in the form of a letter from Ta-Nehisi Coates to his 15-year-old son, sort of instigated by the fact that the officer who killed Michael Brown was not indicted to a trial. And his son was so upset that the officer wasn't going to stand a trial for the death of a teenage boy that he just sort of had to go be alone with his very rocky emotions. And this is Coates' letter about his own understanding of vulnerability and of blackness, and the fact that black bodies are never safe. They're not safe in their own homes, they're not safe in their own streets or neighborhoods, they're not safe when they're in white spaces. They're just constantly under threat from one another, from the police, from white America that wants to continually own them and push them away. It is a really powerful essay, and I think an even more powerful audiobook because it's written in the form of a letter, because he's addressing his son again and again and telling stories from his own life. Something about hearing Ta-Nehisi Coates speaking himself, speaking for himself in that space is really powerful. One of the things I both appreciated and wanted to push back on is Ta-Nehisi is an atheist and really rejects a lot of religious America and this Christian religion idea that if you don't get justice in this life, justice will come in the next one. And because he doesn't believe in an afterlife, for him, this life is all you get. Because so much of the African American population is actually very deeply religious, mostly Christian or Muslim, although many other religions as well, they have a rich religious identity that has allowed them to survive oppression, and he is rejecting all of that. And that is a really interesting point of conversation in the midst of a broader conversation about Blackness in America. I was certainly challenged by this. It made me think a lot about how uncomfortable I am as a woman and how I generally don't go out after dark unless I'm in a group. I really get nervous and physically afraid walking to my car at night, even in safe neighborhoods. I've been sexually assaulted, so I know what that fear is like, that really visceral fear to be in your own body and to know that you are vulnerable, and if someone wants to hurt you, they can. Listening to his story made me begin to think that fear that I have in some instances is a fear that Black Americans carry around in every moment. So that made me really think a lot about race and identity in America. I just really recommend it, and I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, I read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I'm gonna go ahead and say it, I didn't like Jane Eyre, and I know that a lot of you love Jane Eyre. Jen Campbell loves Jane Eyre, Sana from Books and Quills loves Jane Eyre, it's like her favorite novel. I don't know why, because I think Mr. Rochester is a manipulative asshole. I think Jane is not that sympathetic. I think Mr. Rivers is a creepy, completely unsympathetic, hardline fool, and Mr. Brocklehurst is a straight-up asshat. I mean, none of the men in this story are sympathetic, and Jane continues to just sort of be a victim to them. Like, people talk about this being a super feminist text, but I don't think it is. I think it was a cross between a domestic drama and a gothic novel. It didn't do either justice. Now, I think if it had focused on the gothic elements of the woman in the attic and that whole mystery, it would have been a great gothic novel. I think if it had focused on Jane coming into her own, more about Jane rejecting the roles people wanted to put on her, it could have been a great domestic drama. Instead, it tried to do both, and I think it failed at both. I just think there are much better classics, I think that there are much better heroines, and I think that Mr. Rochester should never be anybody's, like, love interest. The whole thing dressing up like a gypsy and trying to wheedle out of Jane whether or not she loves him, the whole lying to her at their wedding, like on their wedding day, he was willing to lie to her and cause her to commit a crime that could have her punished and ruin her reputation for the rest of her life. That isn't love, that's obsession, and that is abuse, and I just don't understand why people love this so much. He is awful. I gave it 2.5 stars. Between not liking Fallen Kingdoms and not liking Jane Eyre, I'm gonna have no followers, but I'm gonna be honest, you guys, I didn't like it. But never fear, I listened to one more audiobook before the month was over and I loved it. And that was Lamb, The Gospel According to Biff, Christ's Childhood Pal. This is by Christopher Moore. This was hilarious and I really enjoyed it and gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I am a practicing Christian, I'm pretty religious, but I'm also pretty progressive. And this for me was everything I love about my faith and a bunch of humor thrown on top. Christopher Moore manages to walk that tightrope between being completely blasphemous and being really satirical. Levi, called Biff, is raised from the dead to write his account of the life of Jesus, and it starts when Biff and Jesus meet as 6-year-old boys in Nazareth and become friends, and it's Biff telling the story of Jesus growing up into a teenager and their adventures up until we pick up the gospel accounts that you would read in the Bible around when Jesus is 30. This also follows all of the events that happen in the gospel from Biff's perspective. I'm not gonna go into what they do and where they go, I want that to be a surprise, but it's full of a lot of humor. A lot of it is teenage boy humor. I will say the only downside and the reason this is not a 5-star read is because there's a lot of sexual objectification of women. There's just a lot of like teenage boy lust and really terrible penis joke. I will say there were some really really strong female characters that were clearly well-rounded and not objectified that allowed me to be a little bit more forgiving to the sexualization of women, but that was just a little obnoxious after a while. Aside from that, I absolutely adored it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Alright, so those are my 5 audiobooks. I also read 4 physical books this month. The first one being Salt and Storm by Kendall Kulper. Now this is called The Witch of Salt and Storm in the UK, and I think maybe everywhere but the US. And Salt and Storm follows the story of Avery Rowe. She is a 16-year-old girl living on Prince Island, which is off the coast of Massachusetts, and this takes place in the 1860s. Avery wants to inherit her grandmother's title as the Witch of Prince Island, but her mother has cursed her and is keeping her magic from her. So Avery must team up with a boy named Ta-Nehisi, who happens to be a Pacific Islander who is on one of the whaling ships, and together they are trying to find a way to break her mother's curse. Now, I want to go ahead and say your expectations of what this book will be is not what this book will be. And so I think unmet expectation is the reason why people did not enjoy this. This is actually a really beautiful book. It's dark, it's atmospheric, you can really feel like you're in a cold seaside town on this bleak island. You can taste the salt in the air, you can feel the chill. It just was really a visceral read, and that is impressive for a young adult fiction, but it is not predictable, and I think that a lot of people were looking for specific tropes, and this book is not going to give you those tropes. This book is going to be darker, it's going to be more grim, it's going to look at the glass half empty side of life, and if that is something that interests you, I really would check this out. It's a beautifully told story, but again, whatever you expect it to be, it's not going to be. I gave us 4 out of 5 stars. Again, the language in here is surprising and beautiful, and I am excited to pick up more from Kendall Kulper. The next book I read was actually an essay, and that is We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichi. I've been meaning to read this for ages, and I know that it's an adaptation of her TED Talk, and I think that this is the most succinct argument for feminism I have ever read. It is very grounded, matter-of-fact, real-world examples of why we need to be feminists, and the way in which patriarchy prohibits women from being successful. It specifically looks at women in Nigeria because that is Adichi's home contexts, but her experiences can really translate across the board. I have never been to Nigeria and I am not Nigerian, but her experiences mirror some of the experiences I have had growing up in the American South. Like when a woman walks into a restaurant, the maitre d' speaks to the man because he assumes that the man is the one who's going to be paying. Because why would a woman make more money than a man? I loved it and gave it 5 out of 5 stars. After that, I followed up with some more nonfiction, and that was The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. I have done a spoiler-free review of this that I will link down below. This is a book that's part memoir, part queer theory, and it's the story of Maggie Nelson and her relationship with her gender-fluid partner, Harry. It's a really fascinating read. You can see all my tabs. I gave this 4.5 stars. And the final book that I finished this month was The School for Good and Evil by Soman Chianani, and this is a middle grade novel that follows the story of Sophie and Agatha, 2 friends who are stolen from their village and taken to the School for Good and the School for Evil, which trains fairy tale heroes and fairy tale villains. But the girls are dropped off in what they think to be the wrong schools. I gave this 3.5 stars. There are some really great things in this book. It's funny. It's very funny in the way that books for middle schoolers are funny, full of fart jokes and everything like that. And frankly, that's still funny. I don't care how old you are. A good fart joke is a good fart joke. But I also think that there were some real flaws with this. I think that this didn't do a good enough job with developing some of the world. I also think that this is a grim book. Like, this is not a fluffy, frilly, fun fairy tale. This is book 4 Harry Potter dark. I'm not kidding. And I'm surprised that this much, like, violence, and real violence, not threats of violence, but actual violence and actual deaths of characters is in a book for middle schoolers. Yeah, I didn't love it, but I enjoyed it. I had a fun ride with this, so I'm gonna complete the trilogy. I'll do a book chat when I finish all of it. Alright, my friends, that is it. Those are the 9 books that I finished in the month of June. I'm not sure what is my favorite book. I think the book that moved me the most would either be We Should All Be Feminists or Between the World and Me. I think the book that made me laugh the most was Lamb. I think the book that I will be recommending the most is probably The Argonauts, but there was no single book that I just adored. This month was a weird kind of up and down, reading month for me. Comment down below and let me know if you have read any of these and what your thoughts are, especially the Argonauts, The School for Good and Evil, and Between the World and Me. Are they books that you've read and enjoyed? Because I would really love to know, and they're books I would really love to keep talking about. I hope you guys are all doing well, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!